In 1929, they bought 5 acres in Burien, and then they built greenhouses. So we were in they grew tomatoes, cucumbers, and then we went into flowers after that. So we leased our property to the Annex family, and then when we came back, they built greenhouses down the street in Manhattan. We were on 160th in Burien. The first one was at distribution center in Fresno called Pinedale. And then from there we went to Tule Lake, California. And then from there we went up to Minidoka, Idaho. Tule Lake they designated as a hardcore center. That was people who did not want to be drafted, people who would not sign the loyalty oath. And so President Roosevelt said that, okay, these people will be, after the war, be sent back to Japan. So my parents, they talked among themselves. They said, you know, there's nothing for us in Japan. So they signed the oath. There was 2 questions that people paused, and they were very suspicious of the questions. One was, would you forswear your allegiance to Japan? And their answer was, we don't have allegiance to Japan. We're in America. Another question was, will you fight for your country? And they said, well, how can we? We're behind barbed wire. That was the 2 questions that the people were very hesitant to sign. And so because of that, they were shipped to Tule Lake. And then my parents, because they signed it, were shipped up to Minidoka, Idaho. Our whole family was shipped up there. I had 3 sisters and a brother. So we lived in one barrack room. The barrack room was about 12 by 12. We separated by putting clothesline across and dropping sheets down. They was kind of separated us in a little bit of privacy. And the room had 1/4-inch plywood, and the top of it had a gap about 4 inches, so you can look through to the next unit next door to our neighbor. We went to Washington, D.C. Lisa was going to be an intern for President Bush. We went to the Museum of American History, and they had an exhibit of the internment and the 442nd. In there they had a mock-up of a barracks room. In the back they had a hologram of Nobu McCarthy. She wrote the book, I Left My Heart in Manzanar. And she had her family there, and she was talking about the camp, and this is the room that we stayed in. I looked at it and had plasterboard on the inside, and it was very nice. And I said, you know, there's something wrong here. So I got up, I went into the room, and I stood there, and I looked at all around, and I don't know what happened. I froze, and I couldn't move. And Lisa and Christopher came up, and they said, oh, Dad, they gave me a hug. And I was able to move on and get out of the room. That's when I realized it repressed memories that I had, and I didn't realize I had. And I think this happened to a lot of the people. That's why they didn't talk about the internment. It was the kids in California that actually made a discussion, because they heard the parents talk about camp, and they said, you know, what is this? Is it, you guys went camping and stayed out a long time? Or what happened? So they told them about it, and they were incensed, and so they said, you know, this is wrong. So they brought the dialogue, you know, out into the public, and they would talk about it. And that's when the movement came for, you know, for redress and what have you. There's a man, Harry Kitano, writes an article about it, about the repressed memories and why people don't talk about it. And he said, you know, there's a fear that if they do remember it, the repressed anger will come forward, and then there's no telling what kind of reaction would happen. We went in the spring of 1942. We got an early release in the spring of 1945 because we had a place to go to. We had the greenhouses and we had the house there. So we did not lose any property or anything. Oh, when we got back, you know, there was signs saying, Japs keep out, remember Pearl Harbor, and this type of thing. Yeah. I remember we got a shipment of poinsettia stock from California, from the Palecki Ranch, and on the box was written, remember Pearl Harbor. And I looked at that and I asked my brother, I said, you know, what is this? And he says, oh, just never mind, ignore it. So I did.
Yeah.
But there was prejudice and bigotry in Burien. I remember going to a grocery store and the guy says, "Get out of here, I don't sell the dirty Japs." And so I went home and asked my sister, "What's a dirty Jap?" And she said, "What happened?" I said, "Well, I was chased out of Turcotte's grocery store." She got really upset, but she said, "Don't ignore it, don't worry about it." So I never did know what it really meant. At that time, I didn't. I knew it later on, I grew older, but as an adult, then I began to understand. Yeah, like I say, my sisters and brothers, they, told me ignore it, don't worry about it. And we couldn't buy food in Burien, so we would go into International District in Seattle, and there's a restaurant called the House of Hong on 9th and Jackson. It used to be a Safeway, and we used to buy our food there. I was elected to the school board in 1989. So my first year as a freshman and a school board member in 1990, I asked the superintendent, I says, "Matt, I need to have a briefing of what's going on at our meetings. I don't quite understand the agenda. So I need to meet with you and you can explain it to me because I don't want to sit up there looking stupid." And he said, "Well, I don't want my board member to look stupid either, so come on in." So I had an hour appointment with him right before our school board meetings. And as I came in, one of the administrators said, "Oh, great, come on in, we're having a cultural competency workshop here." And he said, "I'm glad you came for it." And I said, "Well, I didn't come for it, I came to meet with the superintendent." And they said, "Well, when you're through, come on in." So I did. I was curious. I went into the room and all the administrators, principals, vice principals, secretaries, and all the administrators were in the room, and they were going through a cultural competency workshop. And so I sat there and I was listening. I thought, this is interesting. And Mary Klein, one of the trainers, said, "Well, I'm going to talk about what is prejudice and what is bigotry." And the curtain of denial that came down in that room was so thick, I had to laugh. In fact, I did laugh. And they were pointing at, not us, them, their prejudice, And so Joe Drake, the head trainer, he got up and he looked and he said, "Ben, would you share your experience of internment?" I looked at Joe and because I had never talked about it. Like we said, nobody talked about the camps. So I sat there in shock and I said, what do I do? And I sat there and I thought about it and I said, well, this is too important not to share. So I shared what I did. When I came to the point where I couldn't buy food, our family could not buy food in Burien, we had to go to Seattle. And then when I stopped, finished the presentation, well, the attitude in the room had changed. I didn't understand what it was. And so we went on with the training. And afterwards, the principals had a dinner. They wanted us to they hosted dinner for the school board members. They wanted to mend fences, I guess you would call it. And Ruth Amo was the principal of elementary. And I went to high school with her, so Ruth caught me in the parking lot and said, "Ben," she said, "I wrote you a letter about your presentation, about what you said." And she says, "I didn't realize what experience that you had gone through, and then you just came into the high school a couple years later. So I didn't realize what you had internally." And she says, "So I wrote you a letter, but it was so long that I tore it up." And I said, "I'll talk to you in person and tell you, how impactful your sharing was to us." And I said, "Well, what made the difference?" She said, "Well, you were one of us, that's why." And that kind of really surprised me, when she said that. But when you said that you couldn't buy food in Burien, she said that really struck us because, like I said, you were one of us. Well, kids, I was 9 years old, and we kind of ran in packs, all the young kids. One thing that at the mess hall, they had this like a railroad tie, in a railroad piece of railroad, and they would hit it and they'd call you to come to eat. And one thing, my dad insisted that we eat together as a family. Otherwise, he felt that the family unity would disintegrate. So we heard that bell, the family, sisters, everybody, we'd come running and go and sit together and eat dinner or eat lunch or whatever it was. One thing that I remember was there would be loaves of bread out near the entrance of the mess hall on a table. Japanese don't eat bread. It's not a carbohydrate of choice. And so there'd always be stacks of loaves of bread. So we were told as kids, get a loaf of bread. And so we would all grab a loaf of bread and run out. And we'd head out to the sagebrush. Minidoka was not we didn't have barbed wire. There was barbed wire, but it was knocked down. So we could leave the camp. So we'd go out into the sagebrush, and the older kids would build a fire or sagebrush. And then we would toast the bread over the coals. And I remember how delicious the bread was, the flavor of sage in it. And that was one of my memories of camp as a kid. But we had fun. We ran around. And I learned how to swim in the canal, almost drowned, but I learned how to swim. Sugio Anzo was a Baptist. He was very religious. He tried to round all the kids up to be baptized in the canal. So I asked my mother, can I go get baptized? She says, no. My mother and dad were Buddhists. So she says, no, you can't. And so I was really bummed about that. I was disappointed I couldn't. Because I thought, being baptized was something very exciting and a big deal. I didn't quite understand what it was. So I didn't do it. And it wasn't until 2009 I got baptized here in St. Peter's. And that's when I joined the church. So we had class, we had Quaker, they drafted whoever, teachers, some of the nieces that had teaching certificates. And a lot of Quakers came in. And they helped American, what do they call them, that group, American Friends of something or another. So they came in, we had two teachers. I remember Mrs. Hart and Miss Queen. Miss Queen says, write a sentence. And so the kids would write a sentence and then they would go. And I would sit there. I didn't write. She kept me after school. And so finally she got really angry and exasperated. She grabbed me and put me over her knee and started paddling me. Said, why won't you write a sentence? And so I said, I don't know what a sentence is. So she was shocked with that, and so she let me up. And so she sat me down and she told me, and we wrote out a sentence. And so that was a negative memory of school. But I learned my math, and I learned my English and how to write cursive and stuff. But probably I could have got a better education out of camp in regular school. But they did what they could. There was a man here in Seattle in the Japanese American Citizens League. My brother-in-law, Lindbergh Sada, was the president of the organization at that time. And he said to Lindy, can I get some money for postage? I want to write a letter and a report to members of the National JCL members about starting a redress movement. And Lindy said, well, I'll do better than that. And he cut a $3,000 check and gave it to him. Says, here, make a video and send it. When 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt, he was advised, don't do it, by J. Edgar Hoover, the then director of FBI. He said, it's not necessary. The Joint Chiefs of Staff said, don't sign it because they knew it was unconstitutional. He was Attorney General. He said, don't sign it. It's unconstitutional. But President Roosevelt signed it anyway. And in fact, the church members got a copy of it, and they divided up and they read it to the congregation here a couple of weeks ago. But one thing that's in about the 9066 executive order, nowhere in it does it ever mention any ethnic groups, Japanese, German, Italian, anything. Never mentioned any ethnic groups. It didn't mention camps, going to distribution centers, or going to to be confined in the concentration camps or anything. None of that was mentioned. But what it did do was it assigned the military. What they could do was declare war on American citizens on American soil, which is hugely against the Constitution. And so Lieutenant General DeWitt was assigned the western section of the United States. So he was the one that designed the program of 300-mile area that the Japanese had to be from Pacific Ocean inland. They could not be within that 300-mile. And he's the one that designed the concentration camps. The reason Joint Chiefs of Staff said don't sign it because they knew it would tie up too much of the troops. Because there were two theaters of war, in the Pacific and the Europe. And they needed all the manpower, all the soldiers they can get, but they knew it would tie up too much of their manpower. There was a Colonel Stilwell, was aide to DeWitt. And Stilwell was promoted to Lieutenant General, and he was sent to help conduct the Burma, India, China campaign. So he went there with Merrill. Merrill's aide was President Reagan, then yet, Colonel Reagan. And Merrill after the campaign was successful, he addressed the Niseis, who were military intelligence. They were their translators and what have you. He talked to them and said that without you, the war would have lasted longer. But because of you, it shortened the campaign. And Reagan heard this. And so when it came time to Reagan, it came time to redress, people in JCL said that, Reagan would never sign it. A Republican conservative, he would never sign it. But he remembered Merrill's comments to the Niseis that were in the campaign. So he signed it to the surprise and shock of everybody. Well, to me, the Constitution was just a piece of paper. It had no value. We had a greenhouse. I was in the greenhouse business. I took it over from the family. And we had a greenhouse conference in Spokane. The U.S. government came to Don Sharp and said, would you be interested in selling greenhouses and supplies to China and doing business in China? And so he said, yeah. He said he would. So he sent this man over there. For 3 years, that he would go back there and negotiate and what have you. And he was assigned a secret agent to keep him out of trouble so he wouldn't go into areas he wasn't supposed to and talk to people who wasn't supposed to talk to. And so he was our keynote speaker at the conference. And he said, they were in the elevator, and this agent asked him, what do you think of our country? So he thought about it. He said, it's progressive. People are very friendly, and it's a beautiful country. And there's a huge construction boom there. And he said, they're very progressive and everything else. And so then he asked him, well, what do you think of our country? And the man said, your paper. And he couldn't remember. He didn't realize what he was talking about. He's thinking to himself, what is he talking about? Our newspapers? Our paper products? Or what are he talking about? So he said, I don't understand. What do you mean, our paper? He said, your Constitution. It's the greatest document in the world. And to me, when he said that, I was thinking to myself, that's just this piece of paper. To me, it didn't protect us. So I went home and got the encyclopedias out, and I read the Constitution, and he was right. It is the greatest document in the world. So that changed my mind. And I gave a presentation in the Highline School District, and I made a comment that the Constitution didn't fail us. It was the people who were supposed to uphold the Constitution that failed us. And one of the administrators in the central administration heard that, and they wrote it. And they had it pinned on the wall when I came in, and I saw that. It had my name under it as a quote. And so when I give presentations, I have that in my packet that I give out. And then Nancy was May, I gave a presentation to a class at City University. Dr. Katayama Chris, a good friend, she said, would you talk to my class? And so I did. I gave a presentation. And after it was over, I told Chris, I said, I can't do this anymore. The older I get, the more emotional it is for me. So I'm not going to do any more of this. And she gave me letters that the class wrote. And I read the letters. I thought, I can't quit. I got to continue this. If it affects the kids that much, I have to do it. So even now, just talking about it, I get emotional. So, well, one thing I tell the kids when I tell them, you have to be very vigilant because this could happen again. Because we remember in 1991 when the Arabs were there, and they said we should round up all the Arabs and put them in the concentration camps. This was a Midwest, what do you call it, House Representative. And so it's still there. So we have to be very vigilant about it. And I know the ACL and the Japanese American Citizens League and Anti-Defamation League from the Jewish community, they all rose up and said, no, we don't do this. It's still the United States, so we have to uphold the Constitution.